Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by Lisa WildingBrown, Chief Executive Officer at InnovateMR and one of the market research industry's top minds on data quality. Lisa has been in the industry for nearly 20 years with an array of specialties, including executive business leadership, product innovation, sampling and survey design, panel development and management, online and mobile recruitment, as well as full service mixed mode field management across a multitude of industry sectors. Lisa has a passion for building strong relationships and a relentless mission to drive innovation and efficiency, delivering transformational research strategies for clients through the power of technology-enabled solutions. She's a founding member of the Multicultural Insight Collective, an inaugural member of the Insights Association's Laureate Program, nominated Insight's Top 250 Industry Leader List, a recipient of the Global Research Business Network's Participant Excellence Program, and MRS Research Hero, a contributor of Wired Exec, and an elected member of the SMR Global Council 2021 to 2023. A very impressive resume, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael, for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
You're welcome. So, Lisa, what's the most significant thing you're going to share with us today?
Yeah, I thought it would be great for us to get together, Michael, and talk about data quality. You know, it's something that impacts businesses large and small in our industry. And it's an ever evolving issue that I've been dealing with throughout my entire research career. You know, and even though the issue's grown and changed over time, it really remains fundamentally the same. There's always going to be fraudsters looking to cash out on survey incentives. And, you know, I recently did a talk over at the MRS Impact Show this last February, and they asked me to come on and talk about fraud and data quality and drop some truth bombs and really bring a lot of transparency to the presentation, which I hopefully achieved that goal. But it's really about, you know, spending a lot of time and energy. And in fact, the lion's share of my career, I've been really focused on ascertaining the motives and tactics that fraudsters employed so that we can be as proactive as possible in mitigating the risk around these very nefarious users. So I'm super passionate about the topic and I'd love to chat further about it with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, each of us, all the listeners out there, we know the value of market research, don't we? We know its need in society, but to have this data quality, these fraudsters around, it is a big issue that we need to clean up. For our own sanity, we want to make sure we're delivering insights that are reflective of society, not of those that are bad actors. For instance, data quality, obviously, like I've said, it's a big issue. Why do you say there isn't one fix?
Well, I think we just need to stop telling ourselves that there's a magic fix. I mean, it's a super complex and really dynamic issue. And I've been doing a lot of testing over the years, and I've seen sample providers, large and small, deal with this problem. So it isn't like a matter of if you will run into this, but it's really a matter of when you will encounter an issue with sample quality. And you have to remember the internet, where we source survey participants, is a very dynamic and often messy place. So the tactics that are leveraged by cyber fraudsters really continue to morph and change, which creates this very reactionary position for our industry. And, you know, I love looking at different stats, and I do a lot of research on this topic in my free time. I sound like a big nerd, but it's true. And, you know, I leverage a few different resources. One in particular is Accenture. They put out a report every year, and their latest report said that 68% of businesses today feel that their cybersecurity is at risk on multiple fronts. And this is expected to rise in future years as fraudsters become that much more sophisticated. And so, you know, there's a lot of different permutations of fraud. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit, but you know, you've got straight lining and speeding and poor verbatim comments, which are all things that we've seen in our survey data really since the inception of our industry, right? There are good people that maybe are just having a bad day, or the survey design itself is creating some fatigue and then subsequently behaving poorly in the survey. But then on, the very far end of that spectrum, you have people that are doing this at scale. And what's interesting about those types of very sophisticated fraudsters is it's becoming increasingly difficult to spot their fraud. It's much more nebulous in nature than I think what people realize. So they're really emulating human behavior much more closely than they were, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And that can be problematic for researchers and people that are scrutinizing the data to say, does that smell right? Is that normal human behavior in the survey that I'm observing? Or is that the work of someone that's really doing this, leveraging programmatic scripts and bots and doing this at scale? So there's a lot of different types of fraud and different, I'll call it strains, or like the pandemic variants of fraud. And they're getting that much more sophisticated as years go on. So it's something that I think as an industry, we're never going to solve, but I think that there's things that we can be doing and communication flows that need to be happening that aren't happening all the time. And it starts with being transparent and having great conversations like this, Michael. I think it's really important for us to sit down, pull back the covers and say, listen, I can't fix the internet. Okay. I'm not going to fix the internet. I'm not going to eradicate fraud, but I promise I will try to do my best to educate people out in the industry so that they know what the dangers are. And I'll be transparent with folks about what we see on our side as we're recruiting new panel members day in and day out. And then I think collectively as a group, as a team, as partners, we can inject different pieces throughout that workflow that will deter fraudsters and have them move to a different, more vulnerable target that's not doing all those things. So it's really about implementing lots of layers to tire them out and to catch them before they get into your client's survey.
Sure. What role then, you touched on it briefly, does intuition play in this here? So we'll talk about technology soon, but there's that human element to try and to capture this.
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, certainly there's a lot of technological strategies that you can employ, like honeypots, for example, those hidden questions inside surveys that essentially trick the programmatic scripts into populating that question, when in reality, it's not a question that can be seen by a real human. So those are really effective strategies and certainly technical in nature. You have digital fingerprinting, you have mobile verification, multi-factor authentication, address verifications. There's a lot of things from a technological standpoint you can do, but there is that human element that's so important that, machine learning isn't just quite ready to be able to catch quite like a human researcher can. And so there's a lot of methodological strategies, and B2B, for example, is a huge target for fraud. And the reason why that is because there's high incentives typically offered for those types of audiences. And when that comes into play, you have to go into that research project knowing that you're going to be a target. And so what better way to implement a methodological strategy by including red herrings? And I don't mean just like basic red herrings, right? If you think about it, and I've said this before at other conferences and podcasts, but I think it's a great analogy that helps people really put their head around this. Bots have become so sophisticated and they're quite smart. Siri on my iPhone is a bot, and she can tell me how long it's going to take to get to the airport, what the weather's doing today. She's even programmed to kind of joke around if I ask her sort of an off the wall question, right? So there's something to be said about that human element of really being able to assess the data and look for these strange patterns, look for innocuous responses that aren't contextual to the question itself. And really test for domain expertise. So if you're looking for IT pros or HR decision makers, don't just ask them a basic red herring, really put them through their paces and present a question that only an IT pro or an HR decision maker would know. So ask them about their field, their level of expertise, the types of tools that they're using, the brands that they may be aware of, pepper in some fake brands. Those are great strategies, I think, to really pressure test those respondents, making sure that the good ones get through and the bad ones are disqualified.
Yeah, sure. So how big of an issue is cyber fraud really? We know it affects industries other than market research, for instance.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's another company I follow called Cybersecurity Ventures, and they do an annual report as well. And a lot of their data has been featured historically in Forbes. And each year, every couple of years, they put out some projections on what the next few years are going to look like in terms of total global damages, not only in our industry, but across all industry. And they came out with a report recently where they indicated that they're projecting cyber fraud to cost about $10.5 trillion. That's trillion with a T by the end of 2025. So, I mean,
Wow.
let that sink in. That's pretty shocking. And this other stat that I saw, or factoid, was that if cyber fraud were a country, it would be the third largest economy after the US and China.
Wow.
So it would be exponentially larger than any damage caused by every natural disaster in the world for 1 year, and more profitable than every illegal drug trade combined. So it's very real. It's a very material problem, not only for our industry, but certainly for other industries. And, I think as part of my process through the years of just becoming more and more educated, because I'm not a computer science major from college. I didn't go to school to study cyber fraud and cybersecurity. I've just really learned on the gritty streets of market research through real world experience. But I like to keep in touch with a lot of thought leaders in the space who study this both from a technological and a methodological point of view. And our partners over at Clean ID, as well as Research Defender, are two companies that I really lean on. And most recently, another company called Cloud Research, who has put out a tool called Sentry, which is like a behavioral assessment tool that's really been a huge help in our testing and really making sure that we close those gaps. But in some of that ecosystem data, they were showing about a 220% increase in fraudulent activity from the start of COVID. And so, anytime there's economic duress, whether it's, conflict like Russia invading the Ukraine, or a pandemic, or economic collapse in a particular country, like we saw in Venezuela a couple of years ago, that is going to create the perfect formula for the fraudsters to sort of really start to amp up their efforts. And we saw that, especially at the start of COVID, and it certainly had a tremendous impact on all of us. And the fraudsters were no exception. They're really looking to leverage their technical prowess to supplement lost income. And I think things kind of really spiked back up in Q1 of this year. I think for a number of factors, not just the conflict and the war in Ukraine, but I think the sort of compounding effect of the pandemic, rising interest rates, rising inflation. There's a lot of variables and dynamics at play that I think are lending them to this dynamic of heightened fraud. So it's pretty incredible, and it's just an indication that we have to do better, and we have to partner together. And that starts with having really transparent conversations, also acknowledging that you're never going to solve it, but you don't have to be complacent either. You can really put a lot of those layers in place, pre, during, and post survey, to really make sure that you're scrutinizing the data. I mean, listen, there's going to be dissonance in data all the time, all day, every day. But, it's really about getting it to a level that you feel comfortable with as a researcher. And, data cleaning is an important piece of that process. And so don't just accept what you get, really scrutinize it, and make sure you include traps and different measures within your survey so that you're staying one step ahead.
Sure. So one of my previous roles was working in the anti-money laundering space, and that's essentially there to catch people trying to traffic money and then use it for criminal activities to fund bad things. And one of the things that is almost common across the world now to prevent or to try and address this issue is biometric identification. So you're having to take something that you can identify yourself in the real world and then match that up to your digital self. So it'll be interesting when that kind of thing comes on into the space as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's always this like tension between how much is too much information. I mean, as researchers, I think, and I'll admit this, I'm a data hoarder. I love data. Like I have data running through my veins. It's in my DNA.
Mm.
And the instinct, I think, as a researcher is to ask as many questions as you can possibly get away with so that in case you want to cut the data a certain way, it will be there for you when the time comes. But there is this sort of tension point or friction that's created because people's attention spans are becoming that much more restricted. There's so many fun things to do online outside of taking surveys, Michael.
Yeah.
And, we have to be mindful that as an industry, we need to do better around creating a better participant experience.
Mm.
I think participants will take us more seriously if we take them more seriously.
Yep.
And demonstrate that respect. And so presenting a 35, 40-minute survey with tons of grids, it's not really mobile compatible, is not really demonstrating that respect. So there's some work that we need to do as an industry. I think we've made some great strides in the last few years and had a lot of great thought leadership around participant experience. But our work is really never done on that front. But I think, it's a really challenging situation. There's so many different permutations. There's so many things that are happening on that front.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned that these nefarious survey takers are constantly adapting their playbook of fraud tools. Could you take us through a few examples of these?
Yeah. So, just, searching online through the years, I found different examples of how fraudsters are teaching other fraudsters their dirty tricks. So you go navigate over to YouTube, you'll see lots of tutorials. So for example, there's a video of a gentleman that I saw that was sharing his expertise on how to build a device farm. He gives guidance on how to purchase unique phones inexpensively and host a farm of devices. If you need a survey bot, like don't worry about that because there's another YouTuber out there that has a ready-made bot that you can easily use, and you can even upgrade to a more powerful version for an additional fee. So he's like upselling, he's upselling you. And then there's another one I saw that was sort of outlining the blueprint for success around survey screening. So here, the industry is going to ask you about this, and they're going to present you with these types of options. You always want to pick this option. You want to be a young male, or you want to have you want to be an IT pro or some sort of B2B professional, and here's guidance on how to respond. So like really tactical, strategic advice on how to get through screeners. So it's important that we, make our screeners fairly complex so that we can at least help to kind of plug that hole the best we can. A lot of them are using residential proxies to hide their true location. They're essentially looking to hide their IP address. And the thing is there's good people out there that are looking to hide their IP address. And it kind of goes back to the last question you had around all these different biometric data points or external data points that can be validated online so that your digital persona matches your real person. And there is a tension or a friction point around data privacy. There's more and more reluctance to share that information, which makes it difficult for those that are trying to fight cyber fraud. Like if I had my druthers, I would ask you everything under the sun. I would have you do like a retinal scan to get into the survey, but like, that's not appropriate, right? Like it's a big ask when the value exchange is nothing more than an incentive, right? You're not coming proactively to take that survey because you need it. You need the content affiliated or associated with it. You're participating because you like to participate to get that feedback and provide your thoughtful responses. But it would be one thing to do something like that if you're trying to log into your bank. That makes a lot more sense from a consumer standpoint on why the banking institution needs that level of information on you. So you'd be much more open to provide that. But you'd be surprised in a lot of the panel recruitment that we do, we ask postal address and mobile phone number, and we have a lot of people that just say, no, I'm not sharing that with you. So there is that tension point. And some of the tools that the fraudsters are using are also used by good people. So have you ever wanted to see a show that wasn't airing in your country? And so you got a VPN to change your IP address so that you could stream that show. 5 years ago, that probably wasn't something very common, but I know lots of people who do that. I happen to watch a couple shows that are in the UK. So I have a VPN on my phone and here in New York State, and I can essentially watch and stream content, even if it's not allowed for my geo IP. And so you have those types of scenarios that I think can make it really difficult, because there are these tools that are being used by both good and the nefarious types. So it can be harder. You can't just sort of say, oh, this user is coming from a VPN. Let's block them from the survey, because keep in mind, a lot of business professionals are working remotely from home and they're working from a VPN. Because that's mandated by their company. So you could block VPNs thinking they're all bad, but they're really not. A lot of them are business professionals. So it's tricky. It's a tricky problem to solve.
It could also be that their head office is actually in another country as well. So it may be they could be in their office, but then they're connected up to another country as well. So
exactly. Great point.
So how does someone become a fraud entrepreneur? How do they get into it? How do you get started?
Okay. And it's a great question. It's a really great question. It's actually super, super easy. And I think a lot of people assume that you need this advanced degree in computer science, but like I was saying, there's all these very legitimate tools that are available that can really be very easily leveraged by bad actors. So you can easily rent a virtual data center for about $120. That's going to help transform a single computer into 1,000 virtual computers with unique device features. So that's one way to get you set up. You can rent a residential proxy service for about $60 to spoof your geolocation and your IP address. You can leverage the AWS QA virtual device farm, which I think is very interesting, because that was really created to help developers test different applications across an extensive range of like browsers and real mobile devices. But of course, that service is also used by cyber criminals. So fraudsters can use Google Puppeteer for bot management. That's a free tool that was first built to make the lives of developers easier, and their testing of different workflows more efficient. But just as developers are looking to automate their tests,
so just
the fraudsters are too.
Just on those two then, are AWS and Google doing anything to help the research industry address this?
Not that I've heard. I think that's the challenge, is there's so many different tools that are being made available to help developers, to give them a lot of flexibility in their testing as they go through their own QA environments before they post and go fully live in their release. But at the same time, their fraudsters are leveraging those. I don't think that the likes of Google are thinking long and hard about the implications of how those tools are being used for nefarious uses in the research space. But I know that they obviously are, they're Google, so they're trying to have expertise and patch some of those vulnerabilities. But when you create all these great tools, there are going to be tools that are used for negative action online. That's going to be pretty tricky. So, the upfront costs are fairly nominal. It's probably about $200 up front, and the return on investment is incredible. And we actually modeled it out. And so for on the consumer side, a casual fraudster can easily make about $120,000 with ease on an annual basis. And on the B2B side of things, because of those high incentive payouts that we talked about earlier, fraudster can earn $180,000 to $200,000 annually. So it's and those are really conservative models. I think there's fraudsters out there that are doing a lot more activity at a much higher scale.
And if you're in a country where your dollar is a lot weaker, that 120K goes a very long way.
Oh, big time, Michael, big time. I mean, I know when Venezuela was having their issues several years ago, their currency pretty much completely deflated, and people were having trouble getting even cash out of an ATM there. And so we saw an uptick in the industry of fraudulent activity coming out of Venezuela. Of course, it was masked somewhere else. It took a lot of due diligence and investigating to figure this out. But once we did, we could see that they were all going to Amazon gift cards. So Amazon gift cards essentially replaced Venezuelan currency because that had a stronger, more sustainable value than their own native currency. So it's a great example of when there's this economic or governmental duress, it's motivating very sophisticated people, or even people that aren't sophisticated but have an appetite to learn online and perform bad actions online, that bad things can take shape from there on out. So it's pretty crazy.
Sure. So fraud's obviously a problem that every business has to encounters, as well as sample providers as well. Where does fraud start then? Where does it start?
Where does it originate?
Yeah.
No, it's a great question. I mean, in our space, it actually starts further upstream. It's really in the ad tech space. And this is why there is no silver bullet, and there's no company that's really impervious from the dangers of cyber fraud, because every supplier in our space leans on the ad tech sector to source participant traffic for the most part. And so an example of how this can be manipulated is what's called an identity graph. And in the fraud space, fraudsters click on ads and content that the identity graph, or think of it like the persona, would do. So let's say I'm a fraudster and I want my bot to be an IT decision maker. So I'll create a spider bot to click on an ad communicating information technology value of some sort. And once I have that phone clicking on all the IT ads, I've now built my fake persona. And so ad buyers will see that person as a valuable identity graph, and programmatic sample buyers buy from ad publishers. Thus, they are ad tech buyers. And the ad buyers ask for ITDMs. And of course, if I'm this fraudster, my new fake persona immediately gets exposed to an ITDM banner that says, want to take a survey? So I know these surveys are worth a lot. And as the bot controller, I have my bot controller take over the keyboard and I get through the screener. And once I know I'm in the survey, I can turn on the bot script and take the survey for me. So there's kind of some manual components to fraud blended in with automation. So they're really kind of learning the blueprint of what it takes, what the high target audiences are that the research space is looking for, that are high paying and highly requested. And then, they're figuring out that blueprint, and then they're leveraging these scripts once they get into the client survey. So that's essentially how they're doing it. And I've been studying it for many, many years now. And it's, I'm not a professional fraudster. I'll just put that out there right now. Okay. But I've studied it enough to know the kind of tactics that are being employed. And I don't think I've even scratched the surface. I think there's a lot of things that they're doing that people in our space just don't have awareness of. There's these new kind of variants that pop up. So even if you create technology to patch for some sort of vulnerability that exists, they will hit that patch with brute force. They realize, oh, they're on to me. So then they change their tactics and find some other new vulnerability that hasn't had a technological solution to address it. And then they sort of really penetrate that vulnerable spot. So it's pretty crazy. They're very busy out there right now. And, I think that we need more solutions in our space. If you think about it, there's only really a handful of digital fingerprinting providers out there. And I think there's this misnomer that people think, well, I've got digital fingerprinting, so I'm all set. No, you ask any of the founders of those businesses and the team over there at those different businesses, they will tell you that, digital fingerprinting really looks at quality at the device level. But if people are able to spoof their device or even take action across multiple devices, they're able to easily bypass that. So it has to be this blend of both technological and methodological strategies. And we have to do more behavioral assessment on what participants are doing so that we can actually see what they're doing and how they're behaving, because I think that gives us a better indication than just solely looking at device.
Yeah, I think this comes down to almost like an Uber of sample, where you've got two-way, ratings. So you can rate the survey, you can rate the questions, the design, the outreach, but then the sample providers can also then go and rate the respondents as well. And then basically allowing for that, you can quite quickly weed down who is and who isn't a good match.
Yeah, 100%.
What can companies be doing to better protect themselves from survey fraud? It all sounds
Yeah.
rather intimidating.
It can be, and I have good days and bad days, like I
Mm.
work really closely with our panel team. That's where I started off my career, was really building and managing panels for the Harris Poll, and then on to USAMP, where I ran all the global business research business, as well as our panels. And I think as researchers, we really can take our power back. We have to get ahead of all these different fraud innovations that we've talked about. You do not have to be a victim. There are both really tactical and strategic things that you can do to better position yourself to get those higher quality results. And I think, first off, remember that assumptions are really, really dangerous. And I have to remind myself of that all the time. We work in the data industry, but yet I see a lot of people going with their gut on a lot of things, which is so ironic, isn't it? Like, we sell data, we're in the data business, and we need to lean on the data to inform what's happening. And so don't make assumptions on what you think is happening, really lean on the data to inform what's happening. And there, like I said before, there's always going to be dissonance in data. It's critical. You really have to scrutinize your data closely and work with your partners, and only work with partners that are transparent and open about the challenges facing our industry. There's people out there that you'll ask, oh, how's your quality? And it's like, oh, it's great. I never see any problems. It's like, no, like everyone in our space that sells sample, because of what we do as a function, right? We use the internet to source people to facilitate their entry into surveys. I promise you, every single person in the sample space has run into some sort of quality complaint in their career. And if they're saying they haven't, they're being very disingenuous. So I think it's really important to always level set expectations. You need to stop looking for that cure that doesn't exist, and instead start really focusing on a better mousetrap that leverages that multitude of both technological and methodological strategies. So, don't rely on one single approach as you're going to create a recipe for disaster, I think. I guess remember that fraudsters are studying our ecosystem closely, so they really prey on predictability. So the best thing you can do is just to change your tactics as much as possible to really keep them on their toes. So even like in your survey, instead of having just one red herring, have a whole bunch of red herrings that you rotate, so that each user that comes in is getting a different question, or there's just some variability in the blueprint for success. I think that goes an awful long way. And, I think you have to really recognize and accept that quality does really exist on the participant level. There are some sources that are murkier than others, and different strategies for recruitment that can be ripe for fraud, like incentivized recruitment versus non-incentivized recruitment. So when people get that instant gratification, it definitely makes you a target. Whereas within our panel environment, you have to earn incentives over time. And then once you get to a threshold, you can exchange that for a gift card or PayPal or, other type of voucher. And I think that sort of persistent long-term commitment can deter fraudsters.
Yep.
Versus earn $5 for doing this action right now. You're going to be target with that type of messaging. And I think too, leaning on the principles of just good survey design. So really, when you are authoring and designing your survey screener, you just want to make sure that you don't make things too obvious. And, when I started at Harris Interactive all those years ago, we went through a really rigorous training program on how to design screeners and design questionnaires. And I'm really thankful that I had that experience, because I see a lot of surveys out there that have a lot of yes, no responses. Avoid those guys and gals that are listening out there. When you see that yes, no question, you're like, oh, they're probably looking for the yeses, so I'm going to pick that. And, you're just going to get inflated incidents, inflated qualification in your screener. So put those participants through their paces. Certainly make it mobile optimized. Don't do tons of grids and burn them out, because you're going to alienate the good respondents, the good participants. But at the same time, don't give them the keys to the car, like make them work for that qualification too. So there's a balance. It's all about balance, Michael. That's, I think, the big theme here as we're kind of netting out our conversation today. I think you have to strike that balance and recognize that, listen, multi-billion-dollar brands and government agencies are falling victim to fraud. our industry is not impervious to the same things that are plaguing those institutions. And so I think once you kind of come to that reality, you do kind of get your power back, because you're thinking to yourself, okay, I'm not going to solve it, but I can put an approach in place that's going to really help set me up for success. But I'm still going to look at that data when I get it back. And I'm going to do interim data reviews as I'm fielding, so I don't leave myself in a bad situation where my back is against the wall and I have to get the data to the client, and I've given myself little to no time to review that data. That is an important part of the research process. And I've never understood why we spend weeks and weeks developing questionnaires and we often squeeze only a few number of days for data collection. I think we need to give more room and more space for that process so that we can apply the right level of rigor and standards to what we're doing as an industry. So that's just me on my soapbox.
That's a fair call. So just thinking back over the last couple of years, can you think of any examples where you may have helped a particular client, we don't need to go into names, to clean up, to find, to purify, to get that good sample data quality, and then to see outcomes, like good outcomes come as a result of it? Because it's always
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, clients will come to me a lot and just say, hey, can you look at our questionnaire? Tell me, do you have any recommendations? And I'll do a lot of that, especially if it's B2B research. I'll say, okay, you're looking for sales and marketing decision makers. Let's put a few red herrings in front of them that test their awareness on popular CRM brands, HubSpot, Salesforce, LinkedIn. Different kind of tools that those professionals use, and then include some fake ones. Make sure you Google them to make sure they don't really exist, because that can happen too, right? But if a respondent tells you they're aware of some fake brand that's never existed, then you know that at a minimum they're being very disingenuous, and potentially they're one of the really bad ones. So I think it's just, as a sample provider, you have to be consultative. It's not just sending sample into a survey. It's really being thoughtful around the design of the survey and leaning on your sample provider for advice. I mean, it's not just on the cyber fraud front. It's like, if you're looking for a really hard to reach audience, I see a lot of times where clients will paint themselves in a corner, and they should actually go broader with the type of decision maker that they're looking for. They might limit it to certain departments or job roles. I see that a lot. And I think in today's world, especially with the pandemic, people's decision-making authority and budgetary oversight, it's not always aligned perfectly with job title, or based on the company size. You could be a CEO like me and still be very involved in certain aspects of the business that a CEO at a much larger company would not be involved in. So there's a lot of nuance in there. And I would just say, lean on your sample provider to give you good advice on your screener, and work together to put a good plan of attack in place, and develop a great sample frame that is nested so that you have great demographic representation, and all the different diverse cohorts can have a voice in your data. I think that's really critical. It's like another kind of challenge or issue that I think our industry is facing a great deal with. And it just starts with having great partners and seeing your sample provider as an extension of your team. It's important.
For sure. So lastly, I'd love to see some personas built up of fraudsters, and all the answers they provide, all of the conditions they suffer, the brands they resonate with. Do you have any pearls of wisdom on the subject, or any funny examples to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the ones that typically are hard to find, so low incidence populations, are typically going to be the surveys where we have to offer higher incentive, because we're dealing with that feasibility constraint too. But at the same time, the catch-22 is that makes you a target for the fraudsters, because now you're inviting them to potentially a survey that's offering a lot of money. And so, IT pros, C-level executives, young males, diverse cohorts, boomers, any kind of hard to reach audience, low incidence ailments as well. They typically are the ones that the fraudsters are focused on, because they know that they are typically the ones that offer the highest incentive. So they study up on that. And, if we use ailments as an example, like there is such a thing as comorbidity, right? You don't just suffer from one illness. If you suffer from a chronic illness, you're likely to also have some ancillary problems. So if you're diabetic, you might have eye disease or kidney problems, circulation issues as you age. And so that comorbidity, it happens in a natural way, but you have to really measure what level of over-endorsement is happening. So that's something that we do on our side. We'll present a list of illnesses and we allow for some of that comorbidity, but we make sure that it's associated in the right way with the right illnesses. And we automatically exclude people that are just suffering from every illness under the sun, because the proclivity for that to be real is quite low. So those types of little checks from a programmatic standpoint are so easy to do, but I don't see them happening at a regular cadence like I'd like to. So there's absolutely things that aren't being done that should be done. And, if you're a newer researcher, you don't have a lot of experience designing surveys, lean on your sample provider. A lot of companies out there have researchers in-house that can give you great advice on that front.
Oh, sure. One thing that just came to mind was Billy Bob Thornton's character in Bandits, where whenever he heard of an illness, he mysteriously got it. It was quite funny.
Yeah. The harder that target, it's amazing. People really, they study it. They go at it brute force. Every panel out there, every marketplace out there has bad people in them.
Yeah.
And those companies are not in the business of providing bad people to their clients. That is not what we're intending to do.
No, that's right.
We have high standards and rigor that we want to implement, but it's just a really difficult challenge to try to solve. So that's why I've always taken that position of, let's be transparent. Let's talk about what the problems are so that we can partner together. Because I think it's really unrealistic to expect the sample business to solve cyber fraud. It's not going to happen. My hope is, though, there'll be new solutions and new technologies that will enter our space and new strategies that will help us get better at it. But it's all about the layers.
For sure. So if I can quickly recap what we've discussed today, ultimately about the never-relenting, always present challenge of data quality in the market research space. You mentioned that even though this issue has grown and changed over time, it's fundamentally the same. There will always be fraudsters looking to cash out on incentives, trying to game the system. You discussed how and why there's no easy or single fix to this issue, and why that is not an excuse to do something about it as well. We talked about the size and impact of cyber fraud. It's scary to think that it is the third largest country. But we are in a digital age now, so it's pretty scary to think about that. We talked about where fraud starts in the market research space, which you talked about from an ad tech perspective. We looked at what may cause some people to become cyber fraudsters, those video YouTubes, tutorials, etc., and the pretty low cost as well, which I think was quite eye-opening for some. We talked about what companies can do to better protect themselves from survey fraud, some great tips in there. And finally, we talked about, I guess, the persona of fraudsters as well. Like some of them can be susceptible to many things and have many different hobbies that overinflate actually who they are. But I guess ultimately we talked about it's worth pushing on, it's worth layering up all of the different tools to ensure that we're delivering great quality sample to buyers, to businesses out there. So I'm pretty sure that covered it all. Lisa, any last gems?
Yeah, that was a great summary, Michael. I think you covered it all nicely.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show. If anyone does want to reach out to you, what's best?
Yeah, I would love to hear to anyone listening. If you want to chat further about it, you can reach me on LinkedIn or reach me direct over email. It's lisa@innovatemr.com. I'd be happy to chat about it.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us on the show. And
yeah, thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. And for the listeners, if you have liked what you've heard today, feel free to subscribe, share, or leave a review. Thank you for listening to Now That's Significant.